Thank you all for coming out this afternoon to talk about these issues together. My name is Hermine Hayes-Klein. I'm a lawyer. I live in Portland, Oregon, USA. My work focuses on women's human rights and childbirth. I started this work, I lived in Holland for 5 years, 2007 to 2012. And I taught law in The Hague while I was there, and I had my 2 babies in the Dutch birth system. And all of these experiences together caused me to start to notice and think about how women are treated in childbirth and why we have the differences we do from country to country. And so we'll talk about that today. So we are here together at a bioethical institute and laboratory to talk about how bioethics apply in maternal health care. And bioethics, as we know, are the foundation of all medicine, the practice of all health care. And human rights are also universal. Bioethical principles are universal. Human rights are universal. And so we can think together today about how these principles apply in different cultures, different nations, and what kinds of decisions we get to make when we decide how to apply them where we live. But am I talking too fast? Okay, well, Lenka will let us know if she thinks we need to translate and for her to stand with me, but let us know if that would be helpful. So, I mean, yeah, anybody? Okay. So, in a way, to talk about how bioethics applies in childbirth, we have to question our assumptions about what childbirth is. And there are fundamentally 2 ways to look at childbirth, and different maternal health systems have different assumptions about what childbirth is. So, the Netherlands, where I gave birth, sees childbirth as a normal physiological event with the potential to become a pathological event that would require medical intervention. So their whole system has been set up that normal pregnancy, healthy pregnancy, women are cared for by midwives, because midwives are the experts in physiology, female physiology, and physiological pregnancy and childbirth. And they have doctors and hospitals for the event of pathology. So until 25 years ago, if a woman had a normal pregnancy in the Netherlands and she wanted to give birth in the hospital, she could, but she would have to pay out of pocket because there was not the assumption that you need to be in a hospital to give birth. They've always had better outcomes than the United States or many other nations. But there's another way to look at childbirth, and that's as a pathological event by definition that is only survived through the management of doctors. And this framing of childbirth was developed by the American Medical Association. There are many histories that describe it. In the first half of the 20th century, once there was the development of drugs that could stop hemorrhage, drugs that can cure infection. Medical intervention could really save lives in a significant way in childbirth. And so then there was a real concerted decision to bring all birth into the hospital. In the United States, that meant completely eliminating midwives from maternal health care altogether. So for 50 years, there was only doctors and nurses caring for women and framing childbirth as a pathological event from which babies are delivered and that women survive. And so these different assumptions have shaped how the system itself then develops what we literally do in the birth of a child. And so the Dutch system, because it saw it as a normal event, they've essentially seen childbirth as a family event. Again, when it's a normal physiological event, then it's an event that's a human event. It's an event with great family significance. And so the natural place that they saw for childbirth was the home. And another feature of Dutch maternal health care is that you take care of the woman after she has the baby. They put a significant value on that. So when I had my babies there in 2007, 2012, well, I, like everybody else, got eight days full-time postpartum care in my home. They not only do all your nursing care, teach you about the newborn, they cook, they clean, they go to the grocery store, they do your laundry and fold it, they take your older kids to the playground, all so that the mother and the baby can just rest and recover. And I mean, I'll mention moving to the Netherlands from the United States. I grew up with the idea that childbirth was hospitalized childbirth, that's all it was. And then I moved to Holland, pregnant, in 2007, and I called the very mainstream insurance company. And I say, hi, I just moved here, I'm pregnant. And they say, oh, are you giving birth at home or in the hospital? And I said, it's a normal pregnancy, maybe at home. And the insurance company sent me a box of home birth supplies within the week. And I knew that I could consider this choice because this choice would be treated like a normal choice within the system. So I knew if I would have to go to the hospital, which you always might, that would go smoothly, that the ambulance guys would know how to work with a midwife and make the transfer go smoothly, that if I got to the hospital, everybody would treat this in a straightforward way. The doctors would talk to my midwife as a colleague. They would work together as a team. That's what makes it safe. I could just imagine that. Well, I heard the stories in the United States. Women who would try to give birth at home. Their midwives often underground criminals, not part of the healthcare system. And then if they had to go to the hospital, disaster would ensue. Ambulance guys that don't know what they're doing. They would go to the hospital and they would be punished. They wouldn't be treated, they would be punished for being bad girls who stepped outside the system, with the predictable result of preventable death. Babies die. And so I had both of my children in this system. And the cost to that insurance company of the home birth plus 8 days full-time postpartum care was €5,500. While the cost in the United States of a vaginal birth in the hospital, if you're lucky enough to get one, would be $15,000 with no postpartum care. So clearly the priorities of the system are not based on the needs of the women. Because just having that nurse to teach me how to even change a diaper, I thought, or wash the baby without dropping it on the floor. I thought, what are my friends back home gonna do? Watch a YouTube video on how to do this? But indeed, that's exactly what they do. And I thought, you know, there's a lot of reasons why a woman can become depressed in the postpartum, and lack of support's a big one. Meanwhile, this is how the United States developed childbirth at the same time, through its framing of childbirth as a pathological event that is only survived through medical management. And one of the things that becomes striking when you learn about this stuff, for me it was amazing that all of these images I grew up seeing of childbirth, with the baby held up and slapped on the bottom and taken down the hall to the nursery, and the rows of boxes with the babies in them, were based on generations of women in the 1930s, 40s, to some extent 50s, who gave birth under general anesthesia, completely knocked out. And then I learned babies don't need to get slapped to breathe. Babies breathe on their own as soon as the air hits their face. But when a mother is drugged on general anesthesia, sometimes the baby would hesitate to breathe, so they would do this violence on the baby to make it gasp. The mother was knocked out, so they would take the baby away. None of this is childbirth. It's just how they're managing childbirth. And as a matter of fact, it's not mammalian. You know, you take the baby away from the mammal mother, we all know this, and then you give it back to her later, she will either kill that baby or she will mother it with less confidence. And so why would we do that to ourselves becomes a sort of natural question. This book got published in 1974. This is Frenchman, Frédéric Leboyer, Birth Without Violence. And this image, he said, look at the baby. Everybody looks so proud, so happy. Is anybody even noticing this baby's experience of being born? Is everybody assuming that the suffering and terror that the baby is showing is normal and is natural and is inevitable? He says, maybe we should think a little bit more about this being that's having this first human experience. But nobody got that memo. And so we continue to this day. And of course, all of these, the way we're doing birth like this around the world is done in the name of the baby. All of the people that are doing this to the women are doing it in the name of the baby, under the argument that they're looking out for the baby. Even this, so this is a non-surgical birth, but this is how millions and millions and millions of women are giving birth all over the world. This is, and again, what's striking about these kinds of images of normal birth in the modern world, or in the old one, is where is the mother? Like, where is she here? You know, she's been somehow invisibilized from the phenomenon of the birth of her child. Here, somebody else birthed that child for her. They delivered it, and now they're going to give it back to her as a gift that she's grateful to receive. And here, where is she? Where are these women? Sometimes they're knocked out, sometimes they're right there. But what got me into this work was when I started listening to women's stories of giving birth, including my girlfriends, and noticed most women don't want to talk about it, first of all. They're like, oh, it was fine. But then if you ask them, tell me the whole story, tell me everything that happened, they'll usually break down crying somewhere in that story. And when they would start crying, I would think, You know, they don't get to do that to you. There's a law about this. It's called the law of informed consent. They don't get to just do things to your body like you're nothing and tell you what they're going to do and, you know, expect a thank you note afterward. Who gets the credit? Who birthed this baby? What is at stake in the way that we're framing and how we do childbirth? Doesn't have to be like that, but this is vanishingly rare. And in fact, so this is childbirth under just physiology. Nobody's injected with anything. Nobody's pinned down to anything. Nobody's cut with anything. It's just birth. But where can you do this kind of thing? Because most women, when you actually talk to them when they're pregnant and they're getting ready to go to the hospital, this is what they want is a chance for their body to go through a normal physiological process, but to know that if something happens, the hospital will be there. And yet that's not the way things play out. This is the way things play out. You think this lady couldn't have birthed her baby like this lady? So what they go in there for is not what they get. What they get is hijacked. And what happens this way is that you get your baby right away. And so again, who is looking out for the baby? Is any of that suffering that we saw on the faces of those babies necessary? Is any of the suffering, or how much of the suffering that we see happening in childbirth is preventable? Because everybody shares that goal for the healthy baby and the healthy mother at the end. But first of all, what do we mean by healthy? Do we just mean alive? Do we mean anything more than alive? And then, how far into the future do we look when we think about health and wellness? But also, there's more than one path to a live baby at the end. This is one path. These are other paths. Does the difference matter? If the difference matters to the patient, is it allowed to matter to her? Is she allowed to choose out of this model? And is this available for her anywhere? So again, these were my Dutch births at home. Can you do this in the hospital? Does the hospital hold space like this for women to give birth? Of course the answer is no, it doesn't. Some baby step in that direction, tiny, tiny baby steps, but even that is rare. And again, something important happens here for the baby, something that is actually taught in school, but that then gets overlooked in the training into what we do in obstetrics. And that's that when the baby and the mother, after an unmedicated birth, spike the highest level of oxytocin, which is our love hormone, that the human mammal is capable of producing, so that they will fall in love and bond. And when you actually hear people who've had the opportunity to have those hormones not interrupted with artificial oxytocin, with fear, with alienation, then what they experience, what they report experiencing, is the highest bliss experience of their life, the highest love experience of their life. There's actually a positive benefit to an unmedicated physiological birth that women aren't really told about. Actually, I didn't learn about it till I was 25, and I happened to learn about it. Otherwise, you just don't know. People don't know. And what's happening in the mind of the baby, literally on the unfolding of its unconscious, when it's able to calmly, without fear, without violence, look up into the face of its mother. Stuff happens literally in the brain. That's not my job to explain it though. So, but how do we get there? I mean, what are our options? How do we even think about what we do? In the early 1990s, we had the first international discourse about women's rights in childbirth. And that was when the UN was developing the Millennium Development Goals, and they realized, they noticed that an aspect of discrimination against women was that some countries would just assume they wouldn't take steps to prevent preventable death in childbirth. They would say, well, childbirth is deadly, everybody knows it, sometimes women die. And they said, that's a human rights violation, women's lives matter. And so if you can take steps in your system to save their lives, you should. And so they declared preventable maternal mortality to be a human right. But that was the only human right at stake in childbirth that was discussed at that time. So for 20, 25 years after that point, maternal health systems around the world invested funding in the pursuit of the reduction of maternal mortality. And they did so in a way that ignored all of the other human rights at stake and assumed things like you can really just put them on an assembly line, give them a C-section, I mean, in India, for example, which invested billions of dollars in the development of maternal health care, they developed a practice of paying women to come into the hospital for the first birth. They would come into the hospital, they would get a C-section, they'd be sent home. They're not paid after that to come back into the hospital. They have to pay. So now they have an increased risk when they're back in the village. But not only that, when I read about that, I thought, how are they even measuring that these women are alive? Because we know C-section increases their risk of death by 300 to 500%. So, and then we know that in India there's scarce unclean water, you know, all kinds of issues that could become an issue after a major surgery. And sure enough, Human Rights Watch did a study, maybe it was 2013-14, to find out what's really happening in India. And they found out that for purposes of reporting back to the UN on reduction of maternal mortality, they were reporting that they saved the mother's life, live mother, not even based on did she walk out alive, or was she alive at the end of the surgery, but did she walk into the hospital? If she walked into the hospital, they reported that a successful live birth. And they found that actually if they traced it, there was no reduction in maternal mortality, that in fact things were getting worse, just like they did in Europe when they first imposed these kinds of services. So we would all agree, you know, access to skilled care is a human right. Access to emergency services is a human right. But there's all kinds of other decisions that we can make as a society to ensure and protect those rights. There's a lot of words. And we'll share the PowerPoint in case you want to read it at your leisure, so don't worry about reading everything. But, you know, again, around the world, you could say, in the 1990s, there was this discourse on preventable mortality. And in the last 15 years, there has been a major continuing development of a new discourse on women's rights in childbirth that expanded to talk about the abuse of women in childbirth. Because of course, after 20 years of the pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals, there were systems around the world that have, well, the use of cesarean section expanded massively, as you probably know. And there are places now with 80 to 100% cesarean section rates in for-profit settings. In the United States, it went from 5% C-section in the mid-70s to 33%. And again, with no improved outcomes to show for that massive increase in surgical delivery. In the United States, we have worsening outcomes since we've changed the way that we deliver babies. And instead, now we have rising maternal mortality, which is what you would actually expect when you overuse a surgery that increases the woman's risk of dying. She doesn't usually die in that surgery. She dies in the next pregnancy. That's what the significance of bringing them in and sectioning them for the first birth, is that if they have by the time the woman's on her 4th pregnancy, and if she has C-sections each time, because after that first time, the doctor says, now we won't allow your baby out your vagina because you have a 0.05 risk of a uterine rupture, which would require a cesarean surgery, we're then going to give 100% of you a C-section. By the time she's on her 4th surgery, her risk of dying is 7%. There's no scenario in which the baby has a risk of dying like that in any of the situations where women are denied vaginal birth. So the overuse of cesarean, what we know is it's not based on maternal choice. It's not based on fear of liability. Those have been 2 stories that obstetricians have told since the 1990s about why they're doing it. First, they said the women want it. Then sociologists went to the hospitals and followed everybody around. They found out that's not true. The women were being pressured and coerced or manipulated into surgeries. And when they finally succumbed, the doctors would say, look, see how she wants it? And then they developed the new story. It's liability makes us do it. We'll be sued if we don't do a C-section. Now that would make sense if C-section were safe and vaginal birth were dangerous. It doesn't make sense to say we're safer, we're legally safer if we do something to our patient that significantly increases her risk of dying. So they looked into that too. You can Google this. There are 30 years of studies from law and economics institutes on the overuse of cesarean sections that have proven, that looked into and have proven, this is not about fear liability. It's not about maternal choice. What it is about is provider preference. And the provider's preference can be driven by a few things that have also been proven. One is financial incentives. And those play out differently in different systems, different hospitals within different systems. But they've proven that where there is a profit incentive to overuse an intervention, that intervention is overused. Then they've proven that when there is a time convenience incentive, which there always is, a C-section is 30 minutes, while supporting a physiological labor is highly variable. again, what conveniences the system is that predictability. 30 minutes in and out, then we have the bed for the next person. If we're actually supporting the variability of women birthing their babies, that can be 6 hours, that can be 2 days. We have, it's harder to plan for the institution. This is much more convenient. And then there's just plain old provider preference. We prefer to surgically deliver your baby out of your belly than to deal with your vagina or all that gross stuff. Something that we can think about here is that basically every Abrahamic culture has been taught that the vagina is dirty and disgusting. Everybody has been taught that foundationally. And so then if people are going into midwifery school or medical school with this fundamental assumption that the vagina is disgusting, then they can either be trained out of that assumption, so let's talk about and get conscious about how we feel about vaginas, since we'll be working with them going forward, or they can do nothing. And so then ask yourself, if they do nothing, what's going to happen when those same folks come out the other end of that training? It's amazing how often you'll hear quotes from people talking about what is said in labor and delivery, and people are talking about the vagina. Essentially, the providers, the nurses, the doctors, and the midwives are making comments to suggest that they still think vaginas are disgusting. So all of that can lead to the preference for surgical delivery. And again, your provider's preference for a surgical delivery will not be a problem for you as long as you are the decision maker about your care, okay? So they could come in here and say, it's Friday night. We'd really like your baby delivered by 6 p.m. so we can go home. And it happens, but it happens in the context of coercion, and where women are told, you are being so selfish to ask us to wait around here and not just have a C-section. But again, if those folks come in and are saying, it's Friday night, but they know and you know that nothing's going to be done to you without your permission, you're going to be okay. But if you don't have that shield, you're not going to be okay. In the United States, I think one of the things on this slide is studies show we have variability of the C-section rate from 7 to 70% across hospitals. And they looked into, is that because of the differences in the women at these hospitals? Are some sick and some not sick? Nope. It's about the differences in the culture and the preferences of the providers. And so if you're someone who doesn't mind a C-section if you need it, but would like to avoid one if you don't need it, and you're going into any of those hospitals with any of that variability, your only shield is your right of informed consent, your right to be the decision maker, and their obligation to tell you accurately why they're recommending this. Is there any medical reason why you actually need this? And what are your other options? But instead, why are we here today? Because there is a fundamental confusion in obstetrics everywhere about who gets to make the decisions when a woman is birthing a baby. And so we have all this kind of controversy. All of the questions up on this list are live controversies right here in the Czech Republic. And obstetricians will argue earnestly for hours about whether women should be allowed, and they'll come down and tell you that they shouldn't be allowed to give birth vaginally. In some of those places in South America where the C-section rate approaches 100%, obstetricians now say, you can't make us support your vaginal birth. We don't know how to do that anymore, actually. We no longer have the skills because we only do C-sections. Are you allowed to give birth vaginally if your baby is breech? If you have twins? If you had a C-section last time? And what are we even talking about when we ask if a woman can give birth vaginally? Nobody needs to give her permission. It's not like a door you get to walk through. It's a physiological process that results from the end of pregnancy, like going to the bathroom. Nobody talks about whether they're going to give you permission to go to the bathroom. Because what would be at stake then is, can they get in there and give you a surgery before you make it to the bathroom? That's really what's at stake here. There's somehow been a reframe of cesarean surgery within obstetrics as the default form of delivery, and the decision to be made is whether you will give birth vaginally. And that's sort of a magical reframing of what is physiology, which is that the default is a normal vaginal birth and cesarean is an option which you can choose or decline. But there's confusion about that in hospitals, which is a reason women don't feel safe to go to hospitals. All right, so that was one of the things that got me into this as well. My own midwife in Holland, who attended both of my births, when I was pregnant with my second, she got a complaint against her filed by the obstetrician at the hospital because she was supporting a twins mother at home. And I loved my midwife, so I said, okay, I'd like to see if I can help you. So let me go talk to the mother. And I went and talked to the mother, and she explained she would have preferred a hospital birth. That was what she was planning. She was very intelligent. She had a master's in mathematics. It was her 4th pregnancy. She had read all the studies on twins. She understood the risks of her options. She was ready to go make informed decisions. And her plan was a hospital birth, but a vaginal birth, unless there was a reason for a C-section, which twins is not a reason as far as she was concerned. And so she goes in and 38 weeks pregnant, and the obstetrician, a different obstetrician than she had met in the past, comes in and says, okay, you're 38 weeks, let's plan your C-section. And she said, well, could we talk about the risks and benefits of a C-section or a vaginal birth for me? Her last 2 births, the baby had, the second stage where the baby's coming through had been 10 minutes. And she knew this was relevant to her individualized analysis. And the doctor responded to that question with, well, who's the captain of this ship? And she said, oh, I'm the captain? And he said, I'm responsible for those babies. And she said, I'm responsible for these babies. And then the doctor went straight to, so you don't care if your babies die? But he hasn't said why her babies would die. You know, like there was no, it's not rational. It was an emotional manipulation. But pressure turning to the husband and saying, are you going to let her do this? And so she left. And she called the midwife willing to drive 2 hours to attend her. And so that's when I realized, and the many stories since then, that as the risk of giving birth in the hospital goes up, women will accept a higher level of risk outside the hospital. And that it is a risk to give birth with people who think they are the captain of the ship when it comes to your body. It's a risk to be around people who think that. And women know that, especially when they're in the vulnerable condition of childbirth. So, you know, that's one reason they might want to give birth outside the hospital. Another is just to access physiology, like I showed you in the earlier slide. But are they allowed? Are they allowed to give birth at home? Are they allowed to give birth with a midwife? Are they allowed to give birth at a midwife-attended birth center? Are they allowed to give birth with nobody? And that's more and more of a thing in the United States and elsewhere. As women feel like they've got nowhere to turn, they go into the hospital, they say, if you're coming in, you're having a C-section. So for example, there will be hospitals there, I don't know if this happens here, where they say, you can't give birth vaginally if you had a C-section before. This is not an evidence-based policy. With every decision we're looking at here, there are risks and benefits on both sides. There are no decisions in childbirth that are black and white. This is safe and this is dangerous. There are always risks on both sides of the equation. And there are risks to this baby, there are risks to future pregnancies, and there are risks to the mother. And so, well, I forget what my point was. Well, oh yeah, so, I mean, I guess when the complaint came against my midwife, I thought, well, you know, I thought I really had a choice about where I got to give birth here, but it turns out I was allowed, and she's not allowed. So even here in Holland, we have the same confusion as these other countries that I'm reading about, which is confusion about who allows who to do what when a woman's having a baby. The truth is, the fundamental bioethics of autonomy means that you don't allow me to do anything with this body. I will allow you to offer me healthcare services if I want them. I will allow you to treat me if I accept those services. I will allow you to hold my baby after it's born if you can help it, and then you will hand it back to me when I ask you to. But that's not the space in which women are going in to give birth. So, who is the captain of the ship? This is a live controversy right here in the Czech Republic. Right now, I hear from everybody that obstetricians go into meetings and say, well, what you need to know is we're the captain of the ship. And the law will back us up on that. And so that in a way gets to the relationship between law and human rights and bioethics. Human rights and bioethics are fundamental universal principles. The law will either uphold and respect or protect them, or it will not. So the law can be ethical or unethical. Right? The law can protect your human rights, or it can enforce their violation. And so so in a way, if you want to approach the question, approach it from the perspective of bioethics and human rights, and then you can look at how is your law doing in protecting and upholding those fundamental human rights and bioethics. So ACOG is the American College of OB-GYNs, obstetricians and gynecologists. They have an ethics committee, and their ethics committee issues opinions, and they give recommendations. These are the recommendations to all of the obstetricians in the United States. And so they issued this very nice opinion in June of 2016 called the Maternal Refusal of Medically Recommended Treatment, about whether doctors, obstetricians, should respect women's decisions during childbirth. And they say pregnancy is not an exception to the principle, all right? This is a bioethical principle, that a decisionally capable patient, meaning you don't have a guardian. It doesn't mean you're in labor, it doesn't mean you're female. That a decisionally capable patient has the right to refuse treatment, even treatment needed to save life. That's bioethics. And so what they're saying here is the fact that she's carrying a baby does not change the fact that she's the decision maker, that she's the best person to be the decision maker. Therefore, a decisionally capable pregnant woman's decision to refuse recommended treatment should be respected. And why is that? Because of all these other human rights that are at stake beyond survival. There's the right to equality or non-discriminatory treatment, the right to dignity, the right to privacy, to make your best decisions for you, the right to autonomy. That is the right to own your body. If you don't own your body, what do you own? And then there's that right to skilled obstetric care that was articulated by the Millennium Development Goals. Now, this right to autonomy, and to some extent the right to privacy and dignity and equality, are protected in law through the right of informed consent and refusal. And the patient's right to informed consent correlates to a legal obligation on the physician to communicate with informed consent before they do anything to the patient. And so again, these are universal bioethical principles that then get written into law. So what you can think about is, well, what you want to understand, what are the universal principles? Because then you can look at, is anybody actually doing this? Does our law reflect and protect this? I bet your law does protect it. And I bet that there's just a gap between law and practice, because that's what you find everywhere. That was me saying to my girlfriends, they don't get to do this. There's a law, it's written on the books. But what I came to realize the more I studied is there's a big gap between the law of informed consent and the culture of obstetrics, which ignores the law of informed consent. What's supposed to happen is that before anybody does anything to anybody when they're in a medical setting, and again, you bioethicists understand why. Understand how and why, as medicine developed its technologies and its power in the 19th century, at the very same time, we developed laws to ensure that as we go into that very powerful system with the ability to save our life, but also to hurt us, that everybody within that system knows we do not give up ownership of our bodies when we step into the system. You do not check your rights at the door. The fact that you signed a form to come into the hospital does not mean they get to do whatever they want to you. This is what the law is for. Once you go in to see a doctor, before they do anything, they're supposed to look you in your eyes, tell you what they want to do and why, tell you the risks of that thing honestly and accurately, tell you the alternatives to that treatment honestly and accurately, the risks of those alternatives, answer all your questions, do it in a language you understand, and then support you to make your decision, and that includes the decision to go against their treatment. That's what informed consent is supposed to look like. And if any of you are doulas or have been in any, or have given birth yourself, then ask yourself, is that what happened? And ask yourself, how much would change in the birth room if before anybody did anything to the body of a birthing woman, someone looked her in her eyes, told her what they wanted to do and why, told her honestly about the risks of that thing, induction of labor, for example, told her honestly about the alternatives to doing that and the risks and benefits of all of that, and supported her in making that decision? It would transform what actually happens in those hospital rooms. And the fact that it would transform it tells you what you need to know about the gap between the law and the practice. Because all of these things go into decision-making in obstetrics. There are many decisions to be made when you're having a baby, prenatally, in labor, and the mother and the provider both bring all of these different kinds of variables into their perspective of what is best. And that's okay. It's okay for people to have different perspectives on a decision informed by their experiences. So they're both thinking about the clinical factors at stake, like what's her blood pressure or what does the fetal heart monitor say? But then there are other factors that are affecting their perspective as well. For the provider, it's things like, what is the institutional culture? What does the hospital want me to do? What are the pressures on me? And resources, what are the resources available to me to support this patient? It's not such an issue in a country like this, but in other parts of the world, that's very much a concern. Their skills and training, what do they feel prepared to be able to do? Their medical legal concerns, they do have fear of what will I be held responsible for? What will I be blamed for? What is my responsibility here? Economic incentives and their trauma. Their trauma can absolutely affect their perspective on what is best and right. And an aspect of obstetric care and nursing care and midwifery care worth considering is whether there is services to address and heal the trauma of the providers when they go through terrifying things. Because if there's not, then they're just going to carry that forward and it'll splash out in irrational ways. And for the mother as well, clinical factors, yes. Also culture, values, personal preferences. Every time judges write about autonomy in medicine and informed consent, they say the reason we give this decision to the patient, not the doctor, is because we human beings make our medical decisions on the basis of many things, not just the medical, but our values, our culture, our family, our own support system, and that's okay. And nobody can know those things but the patient. Their family planning. Again, when they're offering the cesarean for the first birth, does she want to have 6 children or does she want to have 2? That for her, if she's able to make the decision, will affect what her decision is going to be. Her postpartum support. Sometimes they had a C-section last time. They know how hard it was. And maybe they have twins at home now and they're going to be home with a baby. They're like, if I can avoid being post-surgical, I want to try to avoid being post-surgical. For example, is one reason why women might decline that. Economic incentives. What are the financial factors that affect their decision? And the way that the system covers care can affect that as well. And then their experience in trauma. So all of this is coming into the shared decision making at any given point, but the law would give the power and the authority to the patient. And why, again, the values shape the risk analysis. But think about the values that are shaping the risk analysis now, when the providers make the decision, are values that look like this. They prioritize short-term perinatal risk. When you talk to the doctors about why they think X should happen, they're usually thinking about, I want a live baby in the bassinet at the end of the shift, and whatever their perception is, they think that whatever they want to do is the way to get there. But there's more at stake for this baby than short-term perinatal risk. There's actually long-term consequences for this baby from the way it is born. And there are other risks. Future risks, there's risks to the mother, right? There's short-term risks to the mother, long-term risks to the mother, the baby, future risks to the baby, future pregnancies. So again, the risk that's created by multiple surgeries that is rarely, if ever, discussed at the moment that the woman's being pushed into that surgery is that the placenta can grow through the scar in a future pregnancy. That's called placenta accreta. And when the placenta grows through the scar, it's a very serious medical complication. The risk of giving birth vaginally after a C-section is that the scar will rupture. And if the scar ruptures, you have to have emergency surgery and they have to sew it closed. That's pretty straightforward to solve. An accreta, I've heard doctors explain it like it's like a bowl that just keeps filling up with blood, and and women die. So when we have maternal mortality, a lot of that is from accreta, a lot of that is from embolism, which is another thing that can happen in surgery. All risks to the mother are undervalued. So when somebody else is making the decision, when you press them on why do you have this policy at your hospital that if you have a breech baby, you're having a C-section, they're not talking about the mother. So again, if you're that mother, if you're that pregnant patient, and somebody else is making a decision that they're telling you is safer, and you're not factored into the equation of what makes it safe at all, are you safe? So coming back to the ACOG opinion, because they make some really nice points. They say, do not coerce women. The use of coercion to pressure women. And what is coercion? It's pressure. It's pressuring somebody to do what you think you want them to do, rather than what they've already sort of signaled would be their preference. And they say coercion is not only ethically impermissible, but also medically inadvisable, meaning it's not smart. And why is it not smart to pressure women in childbirth? Because of the realities of prognostic uncertainty. The realities of prognostic uncertainty mean, you know what, we might think this is the safest thing, or the baby's gonna die if we don't do a C-section right now. We don't know that. It's not a crystal ball. And in fact, all we're really looking at here are slight variabilities in risk. These are not black-white decisions. Doctors call judges and say, please give me a court order for a C-section because otherwise the baby will die and this bad woman won't let me do my surgery. And the woman escapes from the hospital and gives birth vaginally to a perfectly safe baby. There have been studies on that. So again, that's prognostic uncertainty. And the limitations of medical knowledge. So we might think, we have a new study that shows that induction of labor at 39 weeks might prevent C-section. Oh, now we have another study that shows that's not true at all. That's the limitations of medical knowledge. So what that adds up to is, it's ethically impermissible because we should have more humility than that. We don't know everything, and we're not God, and we shouldn't see that we think we know best, but we might not. And so they say, so it's never acceptable. And so they say OBs are discouraged in the strongest possible terms, y'all, the strongest possible terms, from the use of, and when I'm a lawyer, when I'm doing cases and I have an obstetrician up on the stand, I will have them define each of these words for me. What is duress, doctor? It says you're discouraged from the use of duress, manipulation, coercion, physical force, or threats, including threats to call the courts or child protective services to motivate women toward a specific clinical decision. So I'll say, what's duress? And how is that different from manipulation? And how is that different from coercion? And how is that different from force? And how is that different from threats? Because it's really valuable to unpack all of them. The most common one is manipulation. Because what manipulation looks like is, sure, I'll tell you the risks and benefits, but I'll only tell you the risks of the things I don't want you to do, and I'll only tell you the benefits of the things I do want you to do. That's manipulation, and it's unethical. But again, ask yourself, how does that square against what's actually happening in obstetric care? And these principles are reinforced by every body that is looking at these issues of maternal health care through a truly ethical lens. So again, as you engage in debates with your obstetricians on Are Women Allowed?, you could read this case, Konovalova versus Russia. This is a 2014 case before the European Court of Human Rights. Anna Konovalova sued Russia after giving birth at a large hospital that taught doctors. And she described, I mean, again, all we can know about her birth is how the court wrote about it in the opinion, which, so it's going to be a version of it. But even just reading the judge's description of why she was there, what she described was coming in labor, and then basically the doctors used her body to teach the residents by speeding up the contractions and then turning down the contractions, speeding them up with Pitocin, turning them down with morphine, turning them back up, turning them down, and everybody was watching. She sued under the right to the violation of autonomy and informed consent, but also she sued under the right to freedom from torture. And the fact that she evoked the right to freedom from torture tells you something about how she experienced that care. And the court said, we don't know what to make of this freedom from torture claim, which, again, shows you the evolution of thinking on this topic. But they said, but we get you on informed consent. And they ruled for Konovalova, and they said, and of course the Russian hospital said, she signed a form. We tell everybody we're a teaching hospital, and if they want to give birth here, then they must let us blah, blah, blah. And they said, you don't get to do that. You don't get to say to everybody that they must submit to your will if you want to give birth here. They get to make the decision, and they get to keep making the decisions every step of the way. And just like with consent generally, they can say yes, and then they can change their mind, and they get to do that. And so this opinion is nice because it points to a whole bunch of other treaties and conventions that reiterate that we have the right to autonomy, that women have the right to autonomy, and that our right to autonomy applies when we're carrying a baby as well. So they say here, the Convention on the Protection of Human Rights and Dignity, Universal Bioethics. An intervention in the health field may only be carried out after the person concerned has given free and informed consent. This person shall, you can only give free and informed consent if you're given appropriate information as to the purpose. Why are we doing this to you? So again, we have these studies that show it's time convenience and financial incentives. And yet, how many women do you talk to who say, I had a C-section because of the financial incentives and the time convenience? No, they come out saying the doctor saved my baby. And that gap is fraud. That's fraud. So what's the purpose? Why are we actually doing this? And as well as consequences and risks. And you can freely withdraw consent at any time. The principles of consent apply in medicine as they do in sexuality. CEDAW. Women have the right to be fully informed by properly trained personnel of their options regarding treatment or research, including likely benefits and adverse effects of proposed procedures and alternatives. State parties should not permit forms of coercion that violate women's rights to informed consent and dignity. This means that any decision by the Czech government that tolerates the abuse of women in childbirth is in violation of CEDAW. State parties should also, in particular, require, don't just give, don't just say it's not okay, but actually make them do what is right. They should require all health services to be consistent with the human rights of women, including the rights to autonomy, privacy, confidentiality, informed consent, and choice. And notice that informed consent and choice, right? Because informed consent, you can say no and you can walk out the door, but does it make sure that they'll support you in the other choice? Choice points out that they must. It's not just the right. Nobody can make you go to the hospital, and you can leave. But when you're having a baby, you need help, right? Or unless you want to give birth unassisted, which very few do. So you need help. And so, what this shows, I've heard people describe it as the practice in obstetrics is you can choose any color you want as long as it's black. So the question is there another color? And will you be supported in the other color? And so the UK had this decision a few years ago. You might have heard about it if you read about this stuff. Montgomery versus the Lanarkshire Health Board. And this was about a case about the right to choose a C-section. There was no informed consent, and that there was a large baby, and the woman said and she had a shoulder dystocia that caused her injuries. And she said, if somebody had told me that my large baby was more likely, I increased my risk of a shoulder dystocia, I would have chosen for a C-section. But in that case, the obstetrician said, no, I thought it was safer for her to give birth vaginally. I made the choice. I thought it was safer. And so the High Court in the UK made this decision that has then had a big ripple effect in the UK for all kinds of different choices in birth, where they say, again, an adult person of sound mind is entitled to decide which, if any, of the available forms of treatment to undergo. And her consent must be obtained before treatment interfering with her bodily integrity is undertaken. And that, if any, also reminds us that one of the choices on the table has to be the choice to do nothing. That's always an option, is to do nothing. And so to make it clear that they don't have to do anything. And the doctor explains the options, sets out the benefits, risks, burdens. This is all to show these are universal bioethics. Every country writes about this the same way. Benefits, risks, burdens, side effects, and the option to have no treatment. The doctor may recommend, think about this for the obstetrics here, the doctor may recommend a particular option which they believe to be best for the patient, but they must not put pressure on the patient to accept their advice. The patient weighs up the potential benefits, risks, and burdens of the various options, as well as any non-clinical issues that are relevant to them. That's the judge saying, we make our decisions on the basis of factors other than just the medicine. The patient decides whether to accept any of the options, and if so, which one. And the judge went on. In this day and age, don't just talk to me about the baby. I think the doctor in that case said they thought it would be safer for the baby. We're equally, if more, concerned about risks to the mother. She matters too. And those include the risks associated with giving birth, as well as any after effects. One of the problems in this case, said the court, was that for too long, the focus was on the risks to the baby, without also taking into account what the mother might face in the process of giving birth. Do we agree? Does the mother matter? Are we allowed to consider her? Is she allowed to consider herself? These questions have led to the development of this concept of obstetric violence. When I was still in The Hague teaching law in 2012, this was a brand new concept that had just come out of Latin America, where again, this is where the OBs say, they have a joke in Brazil, the only reason you wouldn't have a C-section is your doctor is stuck in traffic. And so women in countries like this started to come together in the way women's rights generally develop in this way. Women come together and they talk with each other about what they're actually living. In the 1970s, we call it consciousness raising. So women come together, they share their stories about childbirth. They start to realize how common these abuse is. And then they started to name it. They named it together in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Mexico, Bolivia, Chile. They passed laws naming this phenomenon of violencia obstetrica. and describing it not only as what we would see as obvious violence, which happens far too often, but also as systemic and structural violence. Violence that basically you walk into that system, like that woman in that blue scene, where she's like, that's violence of a kind that is being encapsulated in these laws. But at the end of the day, what the laws all get to is informed consent. So when I was in The Hague reading these laws getting passed, it's like, why do these women feel like they need to pass a new law? The fact that they feel like they need to make a special law for obstetricians, call it violence, and in Mexico even try to assign criminal penalties to its violation, tells you a lot about how hopeful these women are that the existing law of informed consent will simply be enforced in maternal health care. But these are some of the descriptions, and these are some of the forms of abuse that we're here to talk about. Doing things without consent, cutting them, episiotomy is cutting the perineum, vacuum, sticking things into their vaginas like vacuums and forceps, cesarean, all of these things leave women traumatized, suicidal. I've talked to many of them. Forcing them, pinning them onto their backs, women who are on their hands and knees because that's what their body tells them they have to do, and the nurse comes in and twists them onto their back and pins them down because the doctor wants them on their back. Has nothing to do with their safety or the safety of the baby. Failed anesthesia. This happens a lot. As a matter of fact, failed anesthesia is the 7th leading cause of death in childbirth in the United States, but it's also just very common that it's not working by the time of the C-section. And the woman will be like, I still feel it, I still feel it. And her voice is not heard, just like her voice is not heard at all any of the time, including when she's literally lying on the surgery table and they're literally applying a scalpel to her belly and she's saying, I still feel it. They're like, no, you couldn't feel it. And so women come out traumatized. You know, confusion, and women come out traumatized. I talk to women who are sobbing just telling me about the conversation they tried to have about whether to do the thing, where they're asking questions. And they're like, but is the baby okay? You know, the baby's fine. Are there any other options? This is just our very strong recommendation. Are there any risks of this? Oh, babies just do better out than in. And they're trying so hard to make a good decision for their baby. Then they finally, but they're not getting clear information. In the United States, we would call this gaslit. You're being led to think that you're unreasonable for asking the question, maybe even crazy. And, you know, we're just gonna comfort the little lady. And then they come out the other side of the birth, injured, traumatized, and like, what just happened to me? And they're highly distressed. They can go into psychosis even. Manipulation and coercion. Listen, it's not, they ask a question. My cousin gave birth in California. She got to 41 weeks and the midwife came in and said, okay, we're gonna induce you like tomorrow. And she said, well, could we talk about the risks of an induction for me or the baby, or do I need it? And the midwife said, listen, you're about to have a baby. It's time for you to stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about the baby. My cousin cried when she told that story, and she just, you know, that'll shut you down. You know, it'll shut a lot of women down. She just stopped asking questions. She showed up for her induction. She didn't get that information, and all she was trying to do was make a good decision for her baby and for herself. Threats, you know, threats. Being threatened, we'll take your baby away. We'll take your baby away. We'll call the state, and the state will give us an order to take your baby. We're mammals. Can you think of any more primally terrifying threat to the mammal mother than the threat of loss of the baby? Then there's all this structural stuff that's also called out by this principle of obstetric violence. The assembly line, one size fits all. This is what we do to everybody. So just get in line, we're gonna do the same thing to you. We inject you, then we put you down, then we stick the machine on you, then we slice you, and voila. Abandonment for the medical choices or disobedience, like that's, you know, if you can choose any color you want as long as it's black, and if you don't want it, then you're gonna have to leave. Coercion by threats, and then yeah, coercion by withholding treatment. This can be a thing, like if you want an epidural, then you have to agree to the C-section. All of that causes harm, and we're coming back to that question of there's more than one path to a live baby and a live mother. This is all preventable harm. Why does it matter? Because maternal mental health matters. Why are we even having this conversation? Because there's more space than there used to be to acknowledge that women's mental health matters. I think we have the same statistics in the United States and the Czech Republic. Well, we both had recent studies showing 1 in 5 women report some kind of mistreatment during childbirth, and suicide is the number one leading cause of maternal mortality. And so how much of that, I just did a trial in October for a woman, my client was very broken after her birth, and it was a very normal birth where the doctor just came in New Year's Eve, turned in the Pitocin to speed up the labor, and then doctors left for the night, and then the nurse just cranked the Pitocin up all night. Her body was completely hijacked. She ended up totally injured because the baby was just grinding on her pelvis, but it was obstructed. And she was shattered. She was suicidal for a long time until she got help, and we brought a lawsuit. And when I was interviewing her friends, her best friends, to ask them to get up on the stand and tell this jury about the change they had seen in their friend after this birth, they described her as shattered. Like, you know, she'll never, it's 5 years later. She's, you know, she has to pee on a timer. She's in constant pain. And afterwards, the doctors were just like, it's just birth. It'll heal with time. It didn't heal with time. And her friend said to me, you know, when we sat and we talked about our friend, Laura, and the changes we saw in her, we started to wonder how much of what we saw in our own mother's craziness came back to birth. You know, how much of the suffering that we see in so many mothers comes down to things that happened in birth that they don't talk about, that they don't even talk about with themselves anymore, because the way that they survived and moved on from that experience was to tell themselves, all that matters is a healthy baby. That's what everybody says. And if they say, yeah, it sucked, but all that matters is a healthy baby, everybody nods and affirms what a good mother they are. But that's not true. Mothers matter too. So the key words in the stories that the women tell that leave them traumatized are helpless. I felt helpless. There was this state of vulnerability. You know, a woman giving in labor is like at her most vulnerable and her most powerful at the same time. And the way that she's treated by the people around her is going to either make her feel more powerful or it's going to make her feel more vulnerable. And it's going to amplify one of those stories that she has about herself. So now we have this developing idea of trauma-informed care, which again can be a wonderful lever that we can pull to improve the way women are treated in childbirth. Because if we're going to do trauma-informed care, what does that even mean? It means recognizing 1 in 3 women coming in here has had some sexual assault or violation of her autonomy already in the world. And so what does she need from us? To ask before touching, to ask before touching. And most of them are not going to tell us if they have some past experience of rape or childhood sexual abuse. So how about we treat everybody like this and just ask before touching? That's obviously the sine qua non of trauma-informed care, and yet obstetrics, the few obstetricians who are developing this do not understand that because that comes up too much in conflict with their culture. So they'll say trauma-informed care is, we're going to tell you real sweet what we're going to do to you slowly. And you're going to love our C-sections. We give real good ones. That's, I mean, I know the story, so many times that happens. And so again, it's like come down to what is safe care for women when they are giving birth? What is safe care? Are you safe if you can't rely on the fact that people are going to respect your ownership of your body and the fact that you're the best person to make decisions about this body and this baby? So in a way that comes back to this fundamental question, who's looking out for the baby? Because the only reason that we would say this doesn't apply in pregnancy is if we think somebody else needs to be looking out for that baby. Look, it's one thing for you to make decisions about your body, but who's looking out for the baby? And you know, when people ask that question, ask yourself, what is the assumption underneath that question? You know, who is more likely to be looking out for the baby? The woman who's just grown it out of her body for 9 months, or the on-call obstetrician who just walked into the room and has some, and again, there's also this assumption under the who's looking out for the baby, that a woman is looking out for her baby as long as she is obedient to whatever doctor is standing in front of her. And we know that's variability, right? But the minute you ask a question or indicate that you might not want to do what this person wants you to do, suddenly you are in conflict with your baby and they're still in alignment with your baby. Look at that assumption. And again, look at that assumption in light of all of the studies we have showing the role of the time convenience and the profit incentive and the provider preference. Like if you don't have the shield of respect for your body when you're giving birth, you are completely vulnerable to the preferences, to their convenience, and you just have to hand yourself over. There was this great decision for the bioethicists in the room, that took these principles of obstetric violence and applied it in law. This came out of Puerto Rico a couple of years ago. The Supreme Court of Puerto Rico had this incredible Chief Justice, named Maite Oranos Rodriguez. And this case came before the court. And it was for a case in which the obstetrician had induced labor at 36 weeks because he was going on vacation. And the baby died because induction of labor carries risks. It increases the risks to the baby. and so the case went, the obstetrician had already been held liable. This was a case before the Supreme Court on whether the hospital could also be held liable. And the court held that yes, the hospital could be held liable because the hospital failed to ensure informed consent happens and also ensure that induction is managed properly. But then Maite Oranos Rodriguez wrote a concurring opinion. And this is when a judge says, I want to say something more about this case than we've already said in our majority opinion that speaks for all the judges. There's more to say here. And she said, this case, failing to contextualize this case as a type of violence would be to treat it like a medical malpractice case. She says, if you look at a case like this, where the doctor induced labor at 36 weeks for their vacation and the baby dies, as just malpractice, you will miss the point. Because what we're seeing here is an issue of gender that should be studied and analyzed as a matter of equal rights and human dignity. Coerced medical procedures in childbirth are a type of gender-based violence. This is where this phrase obstetric violence comes from. It comes not from so much the word violence, but from the recognition that the mistreatment of women or the assumption that you can ignore their rights is a gender-based discrimination. There's a reason that this assumption is made, and it's all based in gender. This is a type of gendered violence because its victims are women, and its origins are traceable to how women are perceived and perceive themselves in Western patriarchal societies. Something to think about is, you know, how much do women really understand about childbirth so that they can actually make decisions about it? I hear from women all the time who tell me their traumatic birth stories, just other moms at the school, and then they'll say, yeah, but what do I know? How could I have known whether I need a C-section? And it's like, this is not rocket science. Childbirth is the only area of women's sexuality about which women remain ignorant. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, we didn't know where the blood came from when we got our period. We'd be like, oh my God, we didn't know how the baby got in there. And as long as that was going on, we were very easily controlled. We didn't understand our own bodies in a lot of patriarchal societies. Now we think that's crazy. And yet, there is still one more major area of our sexuality where the majority of women remain so ignorant that they can be easily manipulated and controlled. And how do we get there? Well, obstetrics, again, there's a long history to obstetrics that we won't go into today. But the modern history of obstetrics, most recent, last 150 years, was that modern obstetrics was developed on citizens or on humans who really were not citizens and didn't have any voice or rights. So this guy, he's called the father of modern obstetrics in the United States. There was a statue of him in New York until recently it was toppled because he developed everything he did on slaves. And they weren't, of course, asked permission. They had no choice about whether to participate in his experiments. But it is not just enslaved women who were the subjects upon which this whole body of knowledge were developed. It was all women. All women were assumed to be obedient, did not have voice, did not have rights to real choice in their lives. The assumptions were that they would submit and they would obey. And so what you can consider is that there has never been a moment ethically, philosophically, when obstetrics as a speciality in medicine have had a conference or said to themselves or each other, you know, everything we developed, all of our practices were developed on the bodies of people who we assumed have no rights and no voice. So maybe we should revisit and reconsider some of what we do in light of the fact that we now think women are human beings and more than half of us are female. That's never happened. And so all of the assumptions of foundational obstetrics have continued uninterrupted from the time of their original development. And so Maite says, the appropriation of women's bodies and reproductive processes by health personnel which is expressed in a hierarchical, dehumanizing treatment, is an abuse of medicalization and a pathologization of natural process, brings with it a loss of autonomy and an ability to decide freely about our bodies and sexuality. Therefore, what is obstetric violence? It is an accumulation of elements and behaviors that devalue and delegitimize the process of reproduction in women. So again, this stuff has very deep roots, and we could spend all day talking about those roots because it's fascinating. It goes back to Genesis, maybe even before that. I want to touch on this case, Tarnowski versus Hungary, another European Court of Human Rights case pertinent to what's happening here right now. Anna Tarnowski brought a case in 2010 to the European Court of Human Rights, Hungarian citizen. She said, you know, I had my first baby at home with my midwife, obstetrician turned midwife named Agnes Gareb, and now I'm pregnant again and I want to give birth at home with her again. But here in Hungary, home birth is not treated as a normal healthcare choice. It's not regulated, it's not integrated, and instead there's uncertainty about, you know, its legal status, and midwives are vulnerable and they're at risk if they support us. And my midwife should not be at risk to provide me with health care. This is a violation of my human rights to make decisions for my body. And the European Court of Human Rights agreed. They ruled for Anna Tarnowski against Hungary, and they said, just under the right to privacy, that's our reproductive choice umbrella. Under the right to privacy, we have the right to decide not only whether to bring life into the world and when, but how we bring life into the world, and that includes where we want to go to the hospital or somewhere else, and with whom. Do we want to do it with an obstetrician or a midwife? These are all choices that women get to make. And they said, not in this quote, but in the majority opinion, they said, just as a woman has a right to choose whether, yeah, I already said that part. They said the state violates the woman's right to make that choice when it fails to regulate out-of-hospital birth in a way that upholds the human rights of the birthing woman and integrates it into the system so that it can be accessed in a straightforward way rather than marginalized. And this is worth thinking about because now and then a couple years later, a case came before the Czech court, Dubska versus Czech Republic, in which this woman Dubska said, under Tarnowski versus, she said, we have the same problem here as in Hungary, where out-of-hospital birth is not integrated, not regulated. It's treated as a marginal choice. And so we would like you to order the Czech Republic to enforce Tarnowski and to regulate this and make sure it's a safe choice. And Czech Republic fought back hard. They brought in this Dr. Chervenak, who is the #1 misogynistic American obstetrician. He loves to publish articles about how women should not be allowed to do this or that, refuse C-section, disobey. And that was their expert. And so the court actually, I don't know exactly what happened in that case, but the European Court of Human Rights said to the Czech Republic, okay, we'll let you decide what to do with your women. This is one of the things about women's rights, is like, women are basically considered to be private. And so that's, in international law, issues of women's human rights are often denigrated to some extent with a framing of, we don't want to interfere with your cultural values and the way you treat your women. So there was an allowance made for Czech Republic to not regulate. And from what I've heard, this issue has now come again to the Czech court, which said, okay, look, we're not going to arrest these midwives if they attend you at home, but if they attend you at home, it is not healthcare. And they still refuse to integrate it and regulate it. And so for that reason, it's worth thinking about this concurring opinion from Tarnowski versus Hungary, where the judge said, you know, we're talking about a freedom here, the freedom to do what you want with your body and go where you want with it. And it might seem counterintuitive that we would say that to protect a freedom, you need to regulate. Because traditionally, freedom means the government keeps its hands off and lets you do what you want. But he makes the point, but the background assumption of classical liberalism does not work in the contemporary welfare state, especially in the medical environment. And he makes the point, in this system, everything is regulated, especially healthcare. So healthcare regulation is the default. And if it's only what is regulated is considered to be safe and acceptable. When healthcare is regulated, things that are outside of regulation become sketchy, become marginal. And so in the absence of positive regulation, meaning regulation that ensures and protects access, what is a matter of uncontested private choice becomes unusual and uncertain. Freedoms without regulation are at a disadvantage in a densely regulated world. And they make this, and I can summarize it, so you don't have to read all these words, but it says, what does that mean in the case of home birth? What that means in the case of home birth is difficulty to find midwives and supportive obstetricians. This is what it looks like in the United States, you know, say as opposed to Holland, right? In the United States, we have 50 states. They are a patchwork with the legality of midwives. Because I told you how America killed all its midwives, buried them in the ground. And then in the 1970s, the hippie midwives started to claw themselves back out of the earth and reinvent midwifery. And so now we have different kinds of midwives working in different states with different kinds of regulatory frameworks. And what a study actually came out a couple years ago called Mapping Integration, which is relevant for you guys too because it maps onto Europe as well. And what it showed was those United States where midwives were strong, independent, could do their work, had the best outcomes. They had the best outcomes for babies at the lowest costs, while those states where midwives were not allowed to work underground, where there was no access to out-of-hospital birth, had the worst outcomes at the highest costs because they're still living in 1950s obstetrics where only the doctors and the nurses are delivering the babies. And so they say, and supportive obstetricians. When home birth or midwifery are vulnerable or marginalized, then those doctors who would like to be able to back up a midwife and support their patients can be attacked by their colleagues and that can be marginalized by their colleagues and will become afraid to do it because they feel legally uncertain. Again, like home birth is not healthcare. So if you're an obstetrician who wants to back up a home birth midwife, can you see how you might feel uncertain about, am I allowed to do that? What's my vulnerability if I support this non-healthcare thing? And so home birth becomes a hard and a risky choice. The sanctions applicable to midwives discourage their participation. Most importantly, without legal certainty, there is fear and secrecy. And in the present context, this may result in fatal consequences for mother and child. And so those are the cases I work on now in the United States. When I was pregnant in Holland in 2007, I thought I could see how lack of integration would kill. Now I work on the cases where it does kill. Cases where, for example, the baby is born at the birth center and the baby needs to go to the NICU. It's having trouble breathing, but they have all the tools to help it breathe. The midwives know how to resuscitate the baby and get that oxygen going. They've resuscitated the baby is breathing, they call the ambulance guys. This is in Oregon. Oregon is one of our better states for midwives within the United States. The ambulance guys come in, they don't know what a midwife is, they're not trained or equipped for anything having to do with a newborn. They push the midwife off the baby, get out of here, who even are you? And then they take over, this is our patient now, but they don't know what to do. They don't know how to resuscitate this baby. And they're saying things like, does anybody have the book? And the baby dies. And then when the baby dies, they blame the midwife every time. And again, that will just become one more data point for the obstetricians to say, well, we can't allow women to give birth at home because look how dangerous it is. And so when you look at the studies from integrated places versus non-integrated places with out-of-hospital birth, you look at the Netherlands, which has the biggest data pool, of course, of anybody. They show no difference in the outcome for the baby for home or hospital birth, but it's much safer for the mother. Well, if you go to, and same for the UK and same for Canada, where all of which integrate midwifery and out-of-hospital birth. But then you look at the United States and you will see worse outcomes for babies for out-of-hospital birth. Not a huge difference, but there's a difference. And that difference is the lack of integration. It's not and so what does that mean? It means that the obstetricians' work to preserve their monopoly over these services is killing people. And they're doing it in the name of safety. In the name of safety, to protect an economic monopoly, they're causing preventable death. Fear and secrecy. Again, what does it look like? It looks like looking for a midwife can look like a drug deal. Not enough midwives, lack of integration. The midwives are afraid to do it because are they going to be criminally prosecuted? It's not healthcare. What is it if it's not healthcare? Lack of integration and continuity of care. Again, these studies out of the Holland and other places have shown what makes out-of-hospital birth safe? Integration. Because even if you're in the hospital, emergency cesareans are usually 30 minutes from decision to incision. And so when you have cooperation, then that 30 minutes can happen from home to hospital or it can happen within the hospital. It's all about that smooth cooperation between the providers, and that's a matter of choice, a choice they get to make at the policy level as well as the individual level. And also it's just, midwives can't become strong and economically sustainable, when they are marginalized and left outside of the system. So they remain sort of second-class citizens as providers. All of this is gendered. Just as the relationship between the obstetric profession and the birthing women is gendered, so too is the relationship between the obstetricians and the midwives. Because remember, gender is not the same thing as sex. There can be a female obstetrician talking to a female midwife, and it's all very gendered, the way that they are talking to each other. It's got nothing to do with sex and everything to do with power. What makes it difficult? What are the barriers that we see to human rights being respected? Because that's the thing, you read these studies about obstetric violence, you hear these women's stories, they talk about dehumanization, big theme. They talk about, I felt like I was a dead object, that the baby was being cut off of. I felt like a piece of meat. They'll say, I felt like a dead animal that was being butchered. And what all of those stories connect is that they were not treated or seen as a human being in the equation. And as a lawyer, what I think about what's the solution? The solution is just to follow the statute. The statute says, look her in her eyes. Tell her what you want to do and why. Tell her what the options are. Tell her the truth about the risks. Engage in dialogue with her questions. Learn what's important to her and support her in her decision. If you do that, that person's a human being. Just starting with looking them in the eyes, let alone have that kind of a conversation, support them as the captain of the ship, dehumanization disappears. You can eliminate it simply by following the statute. So it doesn't have to be rocket science, like, oh, what kind of reforms would we have to make around here to end the abuse of women? It's actually really simple. We've got laws. They've existed for a long time. We just have to stop acting like those laws don't protect the rights of women. But what makes it hard? Well, the institutional culture. We had a talk yesterday with students in training for midwifery who talked about the pressure. They said, we can understand this is what informed consent should look like. That is not what we are being taught to do. We are being taught to say, now we're going to do this to you. And maybe consent looks like, okay. So that's the institutional, and where they'll feel, again, when everybody is doing that, then if you're the one who tries to act ethically, they will actually frame you as the unethical one, or you as the one who is creating risk for them. Trauma, burnout, all of these things that, when you're in a system that is, people didn't go into this to abuse women, right? They went into this because they had good intentions. And then they're taught, this is what we do to them. And so what happens over time, numbness. You see it with nurses. They just become numb to what they're actually seeing. And eventually they burn out. They hate their jobs. You guys have seen the midwives and the nurses. Burnt out, exhausted, upset. Compassion fatigue. Those who are trying just get upset by what they witness. Stress fatigue, resource limitations. We're not going to get there we have to recognize everybody in the system matters, for anybody in the system to matter. So the question is, what gets taken away in order to respect the rights of the patient? And with that can come the dialogue in these, discussions with the obstetricians. If you're working in a hospital, if you're in a policy discussion, like, what are they really so scared of in letting the woman make the decision? What are they really so scared of in actually asking permission before they do it to her? Really what they're scared of is that she's going to make a bad decision and they're going to be blamed. All of that can be unpacked. Because at the end of the day, it's her decision to make. But they have to know that they are protected, that their responsibility ends where her rights begin. That's it. They're responsible for doing their job. They're responsible for doing it in an ethical way. They're not responsible for making sure she makes a good decision. And if a bad thing happens, because there's risks on all sides of all decisions, they're not responsible for the decision itself, as long as they supported their patient's right to make that decision. But they need to know that. And without making excuses, because if you participate in policy discussions with state bodies about maternal health, what you'll hear is, and from the well-intentioned people, the people who are having a conference on the abuse of women, they'll say, yeah, it's terrible what's happening to the women, but you have to understand we're dealing with problem X and problem Y and problem Z. And it's like, okay, I get that you're dealing with these problems, but we're talking about human rights. And so we either decide that human rights are inviolable or that they're not. if we decide, look, these human rights matter, we're going to respect them, then we look at the problems and we say, what are we going to do about the problems? You know, but as long as you say, well, we've got these problems, so therefore we can violate her human rights. As long as violation of her human rights is okay and acceptable, you don't have to solve those problems. Those problems just became your excuse to keep violating the human rights and actually leave those problems in place. Well, if you know that those problems make it impossible to respect her rights, and you must respect her rights, then you get to work backward to solving the problem. Because anything else rests the problem squarely on the body of the woman, of the birthing woman, who is the person with the least power within that system to solve the problem. Ethical maternal health care will treat women ethically. That's it. So I mean, again, if you're bioethicists and you get into discussions and debates about what are the bioethics, you can either have one where you say, we treat women ethically, that's ethical care, or you can get one and say, who do I care more about, the woman or the baby? And that's a lot of times what it looks like. Well, what you need to understand is this is very complicated because there's a baby in there. It's actually not that complicated if we actually respect women as the people best situated to make the decisions about their bodies all the time, including when they're pregnant. That's really what's at stake in whether we consider it to be too complicated to respect women's human rights when they're having a baby. All right, that's all I have to say about that. So maybe we could open up for discussion.